Okay, so now the second part of our Australian sort of history segment. Anyone tell me what this is and where it is?
So there's one engine at Powerhouse Museum.
It does. Very educated.
Powerhouse Museum. Let's see.
So, our next speaker, she's not here in the room. I recorded this interview with her last week in Sydney. We're going to try and get her connected to it. The connection to be reliable enough to have it. So, and we have the artists who painted this painting. This is Kerrie Dougherty. So Kerrie Dougherty is a space historian. She was running the Powerhouse Museum at Space Right. Yeah. Okay. So this is an interview I recorded with Kerrie Dougherty. We're going to play it too hard.
Can we tell us all about who you are and what you've been doing for the last X number of years in space?
Well, thanks for inviting me, Peter. I have spoken to the Space Association before, although it was a few years back, so maybe some of the newer members may not recall that visit. But most people, I think, probably know that I was for many, many years the Curator of Space Technology at the Powerhouse Museum.
That's right. Yeah.
I actually started at the Powerhouse in 1983 as a registration cataloguer on what was supposed to be a 4-month job cataloguing the Sydney Observatory, which the museum had just taken over at that time to develop into a Museum of Australian Astronomy. So that was my first position at the museum. From there, I actually went on to do a number of other. From there, I went on to do a number of other projects at the museum over the next couple of years until, as the Powerhouse Museum itself was actually being developed, because this was the period, in fact, before the museum existed as a functioning entity. So I was actually employed by the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences, which is the parent body of the Powerhouse. And so as the Powerhouse was being developed, the director at the time decided that he wanted to include a space exhibition as part of a suite of exhibits that would be developed. But this was actually quite late in the piece for the exhibition development program. So they wanted somebody in-house, if possible, to develop it. And in fact, my time at the museum was just about up. My current contract was almost completed at the time. And I actually had in my pocket the cheque to go and pay for my trip on the Trans-Siberian Railway that I had been planning for several years. And the Curator of Aviation, because I'd never made any secret of the fact that I was fascinated with space exploration, and the Curator of Aviation came herring down the hall from his office to ask me if I'd like to take on doing the development of the space exhibition. So I sort of looked at my cheque and thought about it for a few minutes and tore up the cheque and took on the position. And so I developed the space exhibition for the Powerhouse, which at that time was the first major museum space exhibition that had been, like a permanent space exhibition that had been developed in any museum in the country. And it was also being created during the Cold War period. It was the first exhibition actually anywhere in the world that actually brought together examples of the space exploration and space hardware of the Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, and the United States.
Right. So was it you that got the Saturn V engine in there?
Yes.
Wow, really?
That was one of my babies.
Yeah, that would have been. That's a great.
Well, the funny part about that actually is we had very early on. I had a very different design envisaged for the exhibition because we were working on what was initially a very limited budget, and the idea of was to sort of base the exhibition within a full-scale reproduction of a Saturn V rocket that would be sort of disappearing out through the ceiling.
Oh, wow.
And the idea of getting the F1 rocket motor was that it would be one of the motors at the base of the Saturn V, so it would be a real motor and the others would be sort of cut away to create exhibition spaces. But that particular design didn't go forward. But having the F1 rocket motor, the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum agreed to loan to us, I wasn't going to give that up.
Wow.
So that...
How do you even start to plan something like that? You just write a letter, I suppose, back in those days?
Oh, yes. Well, that's right.
To NASA or Smithsonian?
You write to the Smithsonian.
That's fantastic. Because it would have been a very expensive thing to get out to Australia.
Yes, well, it was fortunately for us that was a sponsored.
Oh, okay.
The transport was actually sponsored by Columbus Shipping Lines at the
Fantastic.
time. One of the things in our favour, actually, was the fact that the museum was going to be open for the bicentenary.
Oh, okay.
So it could be couched in terms of it being a bicentennial project.
Brilliant.
We had a lot of support from the Australian American Bicentennial Foundation, actually, and they helped to put us in touch initially with, through high-level diplomatic channels to the Air and Space Museum, which was very helpful. Dealing with the Soviets and the Chinese was a different kettle of fish, though. That involved initially going through their embassies in Canberra to be put in touch with a relevant person.
Right.
In China with a relevant person within what was then the Ministry of Astronautics, and with the Soviet Union through what was then called the Exhibition Centre of the Soviet Academy of Sciences. So all these things had to be worked through different diplomatic channels.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of interesting experiences in that.
Right.
There'll be whole chapters when I write my biography, there'll be whole chapters of interesting stories about that.
So does the exhibition, is it substantially the same now as it was when because you're no longer at the Powerhouse?
No, I was made redundant from the museum back in 2014, and that's another story.
Yeah.
But the exhibition at the moment still stands in the museum. Its long-term future, quite frankly, is unknown until we know what's happening with the museum itself.
Right.
Some of your members may not be aware that there's been an ongoing proposal from government since 2014 to move the Powerhouse out to Parramatta, so to actually move the whole museum away from the centre of the city.
So is that a state government?
It's a state government institution. But there's been, as you can also imagine, quite a lot of opposition to that move at various levels.
It's a great location, really.
Exactly. I'm not going to get into political comment about this, although I could wax lyrical about my own feelings on it.
Yeah, sure.
But so at the moment, until that whole question is resolved, the exhibition sort of remains as it was when I left
Right.
it. But it had, in fact, we had a major refurb back in 2008, which, again, for those of you who visited the Powerhouse more recently, you may have seen for example, what we call the lab module. Excuse me. Pardon me. Yeah, so what we call the lab module, which is actually a generic recreation of a laboratory space on the International Space Station. But it's specifically designed so that it revolves at a particular speed, which is designed to trick the eye so that it just disorients you enough to make you feel like you're sort of floating in weightlessness.
Yeah,
it's trying to get that disorientation that you feel in that weightless environment. And it's been quite successful. But we actually did a sort of major refurbishment so that we rethemed the exhibition to a certain extent so that a major component of it from that point was living and working in space.
Right.
So it was very much focused around the space shuttle and the International Space Station.
So is there much in the museum, I can't recall, about Australian space and space history?
There's a small component in the space exhibition. One of the big problems that I had with representing Australian space activities was the lack of availability of Australian space hardware, particularly artefacts from the programs out at Woomera.
Right.
So in the initial version of the exhibition, while it was represented graphically, there was only a very small representation in terms of artefacts. In fact, my favourite exhibit from that initial period was the equipment for the ARC, or Aggregation of Red Cells experiment, which was actually carried twice on the space shuttle.
Right. Yeah.
Very interesting medical experiment developed by the late Professor Leo Dintenbass, who was at the University of Sydney and also the Rachel Forster Hospital. And he was very interested in whether or not the effect of the weightless environment on blood and how the components of blood separated out might provide some clue or some way to treat certain bloodborne diseases. And he flew the experiment twice, and NASA was quite happy with the results of it, and they'd actually offered him a third flight, but sadly Dr. Dintenbass died during an operation.
Wow.
Relatively minor operation, but unfortunately he was not a young man. He passed away during that operation. So the hospital didn't want the experimental apparatus anymore, and so it came to us at the museum, and that still remains on display.
Sure.
But in the in the early 90s, we were also able to. In the late 90s, we were also able to acquire some artefacts after the dissolution of the Rawlack Museum in South Australia, which was a privately held science and technology museum owned by Kevin Rawlack, who was very well known in South Australia as a millionaire furniture store owner.
Oh, wow.
He's fascinated with science and technology. He had a fantastic private museum in Tanunda in the Barossa Valley, which was in those days well worth a visit. And somehow he had the right political connections to get permission to go out onto the Woomera Range after the closure of the joint project in 1980 and actually start to collect material that he found on the range. So various components of crashed rockets and things like that. Goodness. So from that, when he passed away, rather sadly, was involved in a major car accident, became a quadriplegic, and then passed away a few years later. And at that point, the family decided to sell the museum, so they put all the contents up for auction. And at that point, we were able to buy several artefacts that he had originally scrounged from Woomera, which included another one of my favourites, which are the fairings from one of the Black Arrow rocket launchers. Oh, wow. Yeah, I'm not 100% certain. We've never been able to absolutely tie down whether it's R1 or R2, but it's one or the other.
Right, sure.
And I'm inclined to think that it's probably R2.
Right.
But we can't absolutely prove that because of the not very good record keeping of where it was originally found.
Sure. All right, good.
Found.
All right, Kerrie, let's fast forward to 2017. And I understand you've been involved in another exhibition on Australia in space. In fact, it's running at the South Australian Library. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, the State Library was the State Library and the State Museum of South Australia were jointly responsible for developing the education and outreach program that is part of every International Astronautical Congress. So the International Astronautical Federation, which is the parent body of the Congress, mandates that the host city, in addition to hosting the Congress itself, has to put on an education and outreach program for the public. And so that in this particular instance, the State Library and the State Museum were given the responsibility of developing these programs. So the State Library decided that it would like to develop an exhibition on Woomera and its involvement with space activities, because Woomera is or was the hub of all the early space activities in Australia, and sorry, excuse me. Yeah, so Woomera is the hub of early space activities in Australia, and naturally they wanted to highlight that connection between South Australia and space. And of course, this year being the 50th anniversary of the launch of RESAT, Australia's first satellite, for those who don't know, and shame on you if you don't.
I'm sure they will know. There'll be a Tesla.
But, so they wanted to sort of commemorate the RESAT anniversary, celebrate South Australia's connection with space through Woomera, and particularly focus on Woomera's space-related story. And I was contracted to come in to develop the curatorial side of the exhibition, so actually help them locate the artefacts, work out the storyline, write the labels and so forth, and then work with the exhibition development team at the library to produce the finished.
And that's on currently running until November.
It's on until the 13th of November.
Right.
That's
if anyone's in South Australia.
Yes. So if you're in Adelaide in the next month or so, I really recommend having a look at it. I was very, very pleased with the way the library's designers put the exhibition together, because it was a difficult task in the sense that the spaces available in the library itself, of course, were, primarily used for flat, two-dimensional type displays, and so they're rather awkward for putting large numbers of objects, especially largish and odd-shaped objects, as many space items happen to be. So, they did a great job with bringing my concept to life.
So you mentioned the International Astronautical Congress, which has just taken place in Adelaide, and you were there, Kerrie. And I understand there was a book you've published in conjunction with that event. Can you tell us about that?
Yes,
book?
well,
I think you've got a copy of it sitting over there.
Yes, I do. This is my
Australia
book.
in Space. I might have to hold it up a little bit. There we go.
Okay, that's Australia in Space. Let me backtrack for a moment before we talk about that, though, in that the Congress local host body or local host organiser was the Space Industry Association of Australia. And so, of course, they're naturally interested in promoting Australia's space capabilities. Some people may remember that I wrote back in 1993 the first popular history of Australian space activities, which was called Space Australia. I've been hoping for many, many years to do a second edition of it, but for various reasons it never eventuated. So the SIAA was quite keen on the idea of actually raising the putting forward the funding to enable the book, a new edition of the book to be printed, so that it would provide an updated record of Australian space activities and at the same time act as a souvenir, as it were, as well as a reference book for international delegates coming to the Congress. So when I first started on this project, the idea essentially was to just take Space Australia as it originally was and add, update the original chapters. But ultimately, I decided that it really needed a major revamp. So the new book is a virtually completely rewritten, reorganised book, brought right up to date. I think the last entry is May 2017. So it's right up to date in terms of the areas that it covers. Of course, it's, you can't write every single tiny thing, so there's some areas are more broadly covered to provide indications of trends, particularly in more recent times. But
so it covers our deep space tracking network and work involvement and things like that? Yeah,
so it actually begins with what you might call the prehistory of space. Many people are not aware, for example, that the very first rocketeer in Australia was a chap in South Australia in the 1870s.
Wow.
Who developed an improved rescue rocket for use in maritime rescue. And sadly for him, he invented a rocket that was considered to be better than all the others available on the market, and the South Australian government declined to buy it. And this is a story that everybody in the Australian space community knows only too well. But, we've had many, great inventions or innovations that have not gone forward because of lack of investment either at the government or private level. So the story starts quite early on. But, so I've actually sort of looked at that pre-World War II space history as a kind of introduction. And then, of course, moved on to looking at the history of Woomera and a lot of some interesting innovations that people aren't aware of that were developed by the Weapons Research Establishment in Salisbury, near Adelaide, for use at Woomera. Now, they weren't developed with space applications in mind, but, of course, they were developed for the missile work that was Woomera's primary reason for existing. A lot of people forget Woomera wasn't created for anything to do with space. Its role was missile and weapons development. But as it turned out, several of these innovations were quite useful in the early Australian space program that developed after Australia decided to participate in the International Geophysical Year.
Right.
So we look at these origins of Australia's space program, and then things like, obviously, the Deep Space Network, defence use of space, the Australian sounding rocket programs that existed through the late 50s, 60s into the 70s. Look at the early days and then the development of Australian industry, scientific. Excuse me. Sorry. Look at various aspects of Australian space science, and of course. The development through the 80s of the Australian Space Office and its activities. And there's also a chapter, of course, looking at space policy and the various attempts through the years to create or get the government to develop an Australian space agency.
So, does it cover astronomy activities as well?
No, very specifically doesn't cover astronomy. There are many other books which have covered the history of astronomy in Australia, and particularly as government has always treated them as separate activities. I didn't want to mesh the two stories together because then it essentially detracts from trying to tell that very specific story about the space activities. And in fact, the original book, Space Australia, took exactly the same focus.
Yes.
I mean, as it is, the book is over 150 pages long, and it would be 500 pages long if we were looking at the astronomy area. But, I mean, given that particularly the SAA's focus in funding the book was to promote or, allow people to see what Australia had achieved in space with a view to, highlighting Australia's space industry skills, there really wasn't a need for a focus on the astronomy side of things.
For sure. So you're involved in the Space Industry Association in Australia yourself?
Not directly, no. Well, while I was with the Powerhouse, as a public servant, I couldn't be directly involved anyway. But, so I was funded by the Space Industry Association to write Australia in Space.
So you attended the International Astronautical Congress. Tell us about your involvement there and your sort of general impressions of what went on.
Oh, yeah. Well, I've actually been going to IACs since 1992. So while I haven't been to every one since then, I've been to a large number of them, and I have a good view of, some congresses that have been better and some congresses that have been worse than others. And I do have to say that Brett Biddington, who was the chair of the local organising committee, had as his goal that this IAC would be remembered as the friendly Congress. And I really think that they achieved that
great.
very much. There was a really positive vibe right through the Congress. And it's interesting, in fact, the last time the IAC was in Melbourne, well, it was in Australia, it was in Melbourne in 1998. And the same thing I felt at that time too, and many of my overseas colleagues said to me that they felt it was one of the best congresses they'd been to in many years.
That's great to hear.
And that was in Melbourne, even with the gas explosion and everything, for those who remember the 1998 gas explosion.
Right, yes.
And I had the same, good feedback from people this year.
That's great.
So I really felt there was a very good vibe to it. I have to say I didn't get a lot of time to attend many of the sessions, apart from those that I was either chairing or presenting papers in, because I was also doing a lot of work with the library's education and outreach program, so I was sort of constantly running backward and forward between the two.
Oh.
I mean, I was there, of course, at the opening ceremony when the announcement was made about that the government would establish an Australian space agency. And because it was quite interesting, because immediately the announcement was made, even though we all sort of already knew it was coming, the room just sort of, the hall erupted in spontaneous applause from all the Australian delegates, and I think some of the foreign delegates were a little bit nonplussed at why we were getting so excited.
Probably saying, why you don't have it already?
Well, this is it. Well, I mean, I've been getting that question since 1992.
Wow.
Well, actually, not quite. I mean, the Space Office did exist then. But actually, it was interesting and somewhat embarrassing that on several occasions when I went to the IAC, especially in the sort of mid and later part of the 90s, I was the only Australian there on some occasions. So people automatically assumed I must be the director of the Australian Space Agency.
Wow.
That was quite embarrassing at times.
So have you got your application in for the new directorship of the Australian Space Agency?
No, I'll leave somebody else to have that headache. I'd like to work for it, but somebody else can have the headaches of being the director.
For sure.
But in fact, during the announcement, it was actually said that the government would start an international search for a director.
Okay.
So whether the ultimate director will be an Australian or somebody from overseas, of course, is still open.
I mean, it'd be nice to have an Australian, but it might be a quicker way to get it to go good results by having someone international.
I think this is possibly what they're thinking, that somebody who has, well, not only international connections but international credibility may give this fledgling agency, an initial burst of credibility, if I can put it that way. And I don't say that in any way as demeaning all the wonderful work that, many institutions like the CSIRO have done in establishing an Australian presence in space. But we're still not recognised at present, except in very small niches, as having that space involvement. And perhaps having somebody high profile from overseas could help us to get that immediate.
Well, Charlie Bolden's out of a job now.
Yes. Lovely man, Charlie Bolden.
Is he?
I actually met him a couple of times.
Okay.
Yeah, he's a very, very nice man.
That's great. So tell me what your thoughts, Kerrie, on Australia having its own space agency finally. What do you see for the next years ahead?
Well, the problem is I don't know, because the government hasn't actually told us anything other than that they want to have a space agency, or that they will establish a space agency. But we don't know what its budget is. We don't know what its authority is. We don't know what its goal or aims may be in any specific terms. And I think until we know those things, it's really hard to prognosticate in any way where, what this agency will mean for Australia. I hope that it will be a statutory authority with an adequate budget that will enable it to support and promote different programs in Australia that we already know there are a lot of entrepreneurial startups out there looking to develop new products in the Space 2.0 regime that, just with a little bit of source funding from government could actually be tremendous developments.
So,
sorry, I was just going to say I think it's very hard to sort of say anything until we really know what those things are, because, we all saw what happened to the Australian Space Office,
sure,
which of course was not given its own authority, did not have an adequate budget, and was not adequately staffed. So despite valiant efforts, it was never really able to achieve the potential that it could have had.
Yeah, sure. All right. So tonight we're going to be hearing from Richard Tonkin on his project from all those years ago. Is there a chapter in the book about that?
Oh yeah, it actually has. One of the things that we did in the book, at the end of each chapter, there are small highlight sections that bring out specific stories, and one of the stories that I've particularly highlighted in these is the story of Australis Oscar 5. Specifically to make a special, a special thing about it. Brilliant. Of course, I didn't want to go into too much detail because Owen and Richard's book is doing exactly that. And they're, in fact, it's been produced by the same publisher as,
is that right?
as Australia in Space.
Well, maybe you can get a bundle going. So where can people buy the book? Where can people buy your book?
Right. The best way to buy it is actually to go online through ATF Press. If you put in Australia in Space on the ATF Press website, that'll take you to the page where you can order a copy. It's available in both a softback edition and also as an e-version, an electronic as well. So you can, whichever format you prefer,
sure,
you can buy.
Very good. Well, thanks, Kerrie. Hopefully we're going to have you back later tonight on the phone, or maybe Skype, and maybe a few people in the audience will have some questions. But
we were trying to connect up with Kerrie, but for various reasons, time being one, we're not going to do that tonight. But we might have Kerrie join us either in person or remotely on Skype next month. So if you've got any burning questions, let me know.